What's up guys, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here then welcome to our little corner of the internet. Today we're going to be watching a video titled Why America's Geography is Unfair, which, what do you mean? What does this mean? There is no word you could tell me geographically that you couldn't find in America. Like, it has it all. And also it's surrounded by water. It's perfect. What do you mean? But let's see what this video is about. Also, yes, I had too many cups of coffee this morning.
For over a century, the Appalachian Mountains were viewed as a curse. They were a rugged, impenetrable wall that trapped the early American colonies against the Atlantic Ocean. But geographers now argue that this prison was actually a blessing. By stopping early expansion, these mountains forced the colonies to densify, industrialize, and unify. I'm Jeff, and this is the story of how a geographic wall built a superpower.
So the title is Why the Geography of America is Unfair, and then it's unfair to the rest of the world, I guess. I was like, is there positive unfair? I guess so.
Before we can understand how this massive geologic barrier forged a country, we have to first understand the wall itself. What exactly are the Appalachian Mountains? To look at them on a standard topographic map today, they don't actually seem all that intimidating. Stretching for roughly 1,500 miles from the island of Newfoundland in Canada, all the way down to central Alabama in the United States, the Appalachians are a sprawling, massive system of mountain ranges. And unlike the jagged, snow-capped dramatic peaks of the Rocky Mountains out west, the Appalachians are draped in lush, dense green forests. They are famously rounded and rolling, and they rarely exceed 6,000 feet in elevation. In fact, Mount Mitchell in North Carolina takes the crown as the highest peak at just 6,684 feet. For context, the state of Colorado alone has over 50 peaks that double that height. So, if they aren't dizzyingly high, why were they such a formidable wall for so long? The answer lies in their unique layout. The Appalachians aren't just one single convenient ridge that you can climb up and over. They're a complex maze of parallel ridges and deep, narrow valleys. There's actually a whole subregion specifically known as the Ridge and Valley Appalachians. If you were an early settler...
That must be so beautiful. I didn't know this. I've heard about the Appalachian Mountains before, but I didn't know where they were and that they were like this. Oh, the middle part must be gorgeous.
Trying to go west, you wouldn't just cross one mountain. You would chop your way through dense, untamed forests, climb up a steep ridge, descend into a valley, and then immediately face another identical ridge. And then another, and another. There were almost no natural east to west rivers or mountain passes to make the journey easier. But the mountains you see today are hiding a monumental secret. Their modest, rolling appearance is completely deceptive, because to truly understand the Appalachians, you have to look back not thousands of years, but millions. You see, the Appalachians weren't always the gentle green hills we know today. In fact, there was a time when these very mountains would have made the modern Himalayas look small. The Appalachian Mountains are incredibly, almost unfathomably old. They first began forming roughly 480 million years ago during the Ordovician period. This makes them older than the rings of Saturn. It makes them older than bones and older than trees even. When the Appalachian Mountains were first rising out of the earth...
Older than the rings of Saturn? How do we know how old the rings of Saturn are? I have so many questions now. What do you mean?
Life on our planet was still mostly confined to the oceans. For hundreds of millions of years, the Earth's tectonic plates smashed into one another in a slow-motion geologic war. As the ancient continental plates of North America and Africa collided, the crust buckled, thrusting the Earth upward. During this violent era of mountain building, geologists believe the jagged peaks of the Appalachians likely soared to elevations comparable to the Himalayas.
What? I mean, I knew that there once in the past there was just one blob of earth and one blob of ocean, but it still amuses me how they can move so much that they're right now on the other side of the world. Like, what's the science behind that? Is that something that we can confirm that happened? Does Africa actually match the coast of America like that? That's crazy. And also, if they hit together, why did they separate? Okay, I have too many questions.
Geologists believe the jagged peaks of the Appalachians likely soared to elevations comparable to the Himalayas today, perhaps even reaching 30,000 feet or more into the sky. So where did all that rock go? Time and water explains it all. Because the Appalachians are so incredibly old, they have been subjected to hundreds of millions of years of relentless erosion. Rain, wind, freezing ice, and thawing summers literally ground these Himalayan-sized peaks down to the rounded nubs we see today. The sediment from these massive ancient mountains slowly washed away, gradually creating the flat, fertile coastal plains of the eastern seaboard, the very land that would eventually sustain the early American colonies. But as the ancient supercontinent of Pangaea assembled and then violently tore itself apart, it left behind a geographic mystery. What if I told you that to find the rest of the Appalachian Mountains, you'd have to leave the North American continent completely? When the continents were fused together into Pangaea about 300 million...
I mean, this makes no sense. I mean, I guess it didn't look like this back then, no, but you know, obviously it didn't look like this. Like, they just hit together, and then there was like a desert, and this, because this is a completely different time. But I don't know, this just makes no sense to me. Just makes no sense to me. And Europe too, with England there in the middle, makes no sense. Why did I not just why have I never thought about this before? My brain is blown away.
Years ago, the Appalachians were just the central section of a massive, continuous mountain chain known as the Central Pangaean Mountains. This mega range acted as the rocky spine of the supercontinent. When Pangaea eventually broke apart, the newly formed Atlantic Ocean flooded into the rift, separating the continents and ripping the mountain range into pieces. The central chunk stayed in North America and became the Appalachians, but the eastern edge was carried away on the African tectonic plate. Today, those mountains still stand proudly in Morocco. We call them the Anti-Atlas Mountains. Meanwhile, the northernmost section of this ancient chain were dragged off on the Eurasian plate. If you travel to the UK and hike the dramatic misty peaks of the Scottish Highlands, or explore the rugged mountains of Scandinavia, you're actually walking on the exact same rock formations. Geologically speaking, the Scottish Highlands, the Atlas Mountains, and the Appalachians are all the exact same mountain range.
So if I've been to Norway, does that mean that I've been to America, basically? Practically? Anyone? I'm kidding.
Separated only by an ocean of time and water. This ancient, eroded, continent-spanning wall is what awaited the first European settlers. It was a dense, dark, and seemingly endless labyrinth of ridges and valleys that effectively shut the door to the interior of the North American continent. But a mountain range is more than just rocks and trees. For thousands of years before Europeans ever arrived, this rugged landscape was already home to complex human societies that knew exactly how to navigate the impenetrable. So, how did the early indigenous groups survive the labyrinth? And what exactly happened when a rapidly expanding colonial wave of colonial settlers finally crashed into that immovable wall? We're gonna see exactly how those early nations navigated that massive labyrinth, and why European settlers were trapped behind it for over a century in just a second. But first, since we're talking about the Appalachians, I'm actually launching a brand new, highly detailed map of this.
I can't waste any more money. Thank you.
When European settlers looked west from the Atlantic coast, they saw an impenetrable fortress of wood and stone. But to the indigenous peoples of North America, the Appalachian Mountains were never really a wall. They were a home, a fortress, and a bustling network of highways. For over 10,000 years, Native American nations navigated the complex ridges and deep valleys that terrified the early Europeans. In the north, the powerful Iroquois Confederacy dominated the terrain, using the geography to control trade and protect their borders. In the south, the Cherokee built sprawling, sophisticated towns in the river valleys, perfectly adapting their agricultural practices to the mountain climate. In fact, long before Europeans ever set foot on the continent, a sprawling path known as the Great Indian Warpath ran the length of the Appalachians, connecting tribes from modern-day New York all the way to Alabama. But in the 17th century, a new force arrived on the eastern shores of the continent, and the balance of the mountains was about to be shattered. When the first English colonists established Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620, they clung tightly to the Atlantic coastal plain. For the first century and a half of American colonial history, European settlement barely pushed inland. Why? Because geography dictated their limits. The early colonies relied heavily on navigable rivers to transport goods like tobacco and timber back to Europe. But just a few dozen miles inland, the coastal rivers hit something called the fall line, a geographic boundary where the soft, flat sediment of the coast meets the hard bedrock of the Piedmont region, creating waterfalls and rapids that both simply couldn't pass. Beyond the fall line loomed the blue, hazy ridges of the Appalachians. To the British Crown, this geographic barrier was incredibly convenient. In fact, after the French and Indian War, the British government issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This law literally drew a line down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and made it strictly illegal for colonists to settle west of it. The British wanted to keep the colonists neatly penned against the coast where they could be easily taxed, governed, and controlled, while leaving the deep interior to their Native American allies. But a geographic wall and a political line were no match for the desire for more land. By the mid-1700s, the American colonies were experiencing a massive population boom. Coastal farmlands were becoming exhausted, and a new generation of Americans were desperate for land, and so they looked west. They knew vast, fertile plains existed on the other side of the mountains, but every attempt to cross with wagons, livestock, and families was thwarted by the endless, brutal ridges of the Appalachians.
Do the Appalachians now have like tunnel systems or something? I mean, I guess not. If they're not like, I guess they're way bigger than what I think in my head. I guess the area is way bigger than what I imagine. How does it work now? How do you? Is there highways, roads, planes? How does it work nowadays?
So, how do you cross an uncrossable mountain range? Well, you don't climb over it. You just gotta find the crack where you can squeeze through. Deep in the intersection of modern-day Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee, geography had provided a miraculous loophole. Millions of years ago, a meteorite strike weakened the bedrock in a specific area of the mountains. Over countless millennia, a river carved through this weakened rock, leaving behind a deep V-shaped notch in an otherwise solid ridge. This is the Cumberland Gap. While indigenous people had used this gap for centuries, it wasn't until 1750 that a colonial explorer named Dr. Thomas Walker documented it for the Europeans. But the man who blew the doors wide open was a frontiersman named Daniel Boone. In 1775, Boone and a team of axemen hacked a 200-mile trail through the Cumberland Gap, creating the Wilderness Road. It was far from a modern highway, though. The Wilderness Road was a brutal, steep, muddy, and dangerous path. Wagons frequently shattered, pack animals died, and violent clashes with the Cherokee and Shawnee, who were desperately trying to defend their ancestral lands from this sudden invasion, were a constant reality. The conquering of the Appalachians was not a peaceful expansion. It was a devastating displacement of the indigenous population who had thrived there for thousands of years. Yet, despite the extreme hardships, the crack in the wall had been found. The floodgates opened. Within just a few decades, over 300.
I wonder what the natives felt like suddenly just boats arrive with people. Like imagine now, like suddenly just for people who live in coastal areas, boats arrived with people we've never seen before with completely different skin color and completely different speech and everything, and they just came here and started taking our land. That's not a very nice way to put it, but just imagine for a second. Like, how scary is that? I would be terrified if like green, blue skinned people came here to the coastal line in boats and just started like living here. I'd be like, excuse you? What? I hope that's not, what is it called? Offensive. I'm just saying, that must have been crazy.
100,000 settlers poured through the Cumberland Gap, spilling out into the vast open plains of the Ohio River Valley. The immovable wall had finally been breached. The United States was suddenly untethered, beginning its rapid, unstoppable march towards the Pacific Ocean. But conquering the mountains is only half the story, because while the American pioneers eventually broke through to the other side, geographers argue that the true secret to American dominance isn't that they crossed the Appalachians. It's that they were trapped behind them for 150 years. We've seen how the impenetrable geography of the Appalachians kept European colonists confined to the Atlantic coast. And we've seen the sheer willpower it took to finally punch a hole through that wall. But geographies point to a fascinating historic what if that changes how we view these mountains entirely. What if the east coast of North America had been as flat and open as the Great Plains? What if those early settlers had met no resistance and could have simply walked endlessly westward from the moment they landed? If that had happened, the United States as we know it today likely wouldn't exist. Without a geographic barrier to stop them, early colonists would have immediately dispersed. They would have spread out thinly across millions of square miles of the vast American interior. They would have formed isolated, disconnected farming communities, scattered from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. Without proximity to one another, they wouldn't have needed to build massive coastal trade networks, and they certainly wouldn't have developed a unified, shared identity. By trapping the colonists against the ocean for 150 years, the Appalachian Mountains forced something crucial: densification. Because they couldn't expand outward, the 13 colonies had to build upward and inward. They built deep water ports. They constructed dense, bustling cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Because expanding west was impossible, they turned their economic focus north and south, trading heavily with one another along the coastline. This forced economic reliance bred a shared political and cultural identity. 13 incredibly distinct, wildly different colonies were squished together until they began to see themselves as a single, unified entity. But how did this forced proximity...
Interesting. Does that also mean that New York and Philadelphia and Boston and all of that were the first major cities? Maybe? I don't know.
Defeat the greatest military empire on Earth? When the American Revolution erupted, that coastal densification became the colony's greatest weapon. Because the American population was concentrated along the eastern seaboard, they could communicate quickly, organize militias, and maintain relatively short supply lines. If the colonial population had been scattered across the Midwest, the British military would have easily divided and conquered them piecemeal. The Appalachian Mountains literally guarded the Americans' backs, preventing the British from easily flanking them from the deep interior. In short, the geographic prison of the Appalachians incubated the United States. It gave the country the time, the density, and the industrial foundation it needed to survive its early fragile years. By the time the country finally spilled through the Cumberland Gap and breached the mountains in the early 1800s, they weren't just a loose band of vulnerable farmers anymore. They were an industrializing, unified country with a centralized government, a booming population, and a rapidly advancing technologic base. And they were going to need every ounce of that industrial power, because out west, a much more terrifying geographic monster awaited. If the early colonists had somehow bypassed the Appalachians and immediately hit the sheer, jagged 14,000-foot peaks of the Rocky Mountains or the unforgiving deserts of the Great Basin, the westward expansion would have completely collapsed. They simply wouldn't have had the technology or the numbers to survive it. The Appalachians acted as the perfect set of training wheels for American expansion. By forcing the US to industrialize first, the country was prepared for the West. By the time Americans had to cross the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas, they weren't just relying on wooden wagons. They were laying down thousands of miles of transcontinental railroads, stringing up telegraph wires, and using the massive manufacturing base they had built back east. The wall that once held them back had prepared them to conquer a continent. But while the United States moved on to dominate the West, what happened to the mountains themselves? Today, the Appalachian Mountains are no longer a barrier to transportation. Highways tunnel right through the ancient
They tunnel. See, I knew that. I knew that.
bedrock, and airplanes soar effortlessly over the rolling green ridges.
I mean, obviously, is there any other way to cross a mountain than airplanes, tunnels, and roads? But hey, don't take the credit from me. I knew it.
Highways tunnel right through the ancient bedrock, and airplanes soar effortlessly over the rolling green ridges. Yet, the mountains remain a vital, irreplaceable part of the American fabric. Physically, they became the engine of the American Industrial Revolution. For over a century, the incredibly rich coal seams buried deep within the Appalachian bedrock powered the country's factories, heated its homes, and fueled the trains that connected the coasts. Today, they're also one of the country's greatest natural playgrounds, home to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the most visited national park in the country, and the legendary Appalachian Trail.
The most visited national Great Smoky Mountains. I've never heard of that. Or maybe I have, but I just don't remember. The most visited one in the country. Interesting.
National Park, the most visited national park in the country, and the legendary Appalachian Trail, a 2,190-mile continuous footpath that stretches from Georgia to Maine. But beyond the physical, Appalachia exists today as one of the most distinct cultural regions in the United States. The deep, isolated valleys that once trapped early pioneers eventually created pockets of unique, incredibly preserved culture. The region birthed entirely new genres of American music, like bluegrass and country, rooted in the Scottish and Irish heritage of the people who settled the harsh ridges. It's a region of its own distinct dialects, folklore, and deeply ingrained traditions of self-reliance. And because of that, the Appalachians remain the most important mountain range in North America, even if they're just tiny nubs compared to the Rockies. For over a century, the Appalachian Mountains were viewed as a curse, a rugged, impenetrable wall of tree and stone. But history has actually proven otherwise. By standing in the way, this ancient, eroded mountain range forced 13 colonies to stop, grow together, and build the foundation for an industrial powerhouse. So the Appalachians didn't trap the United States, it forged it. This week, I'm in Guatemala, hiking up to the top of an active volcano to watch it erupt and answer the question, why are
What? What was that switch up? You're hiking a mountain that's going to erupt. Are you crazy?
hiking up to the top of an
That's crazy.
active volcano to watch it erupt and answer the question, why are Central America's volcanoes so much more active than North America's? So come join me over on my travel channel. I hope you enjoyed learning all about the Appalachian Mountains. If you did, be sure to check out this video all about how Minnesota shaped the United States.
That's crazy. That's crazy. I really like this end screen. Should I make an end screen? I should probably do that. This is beautiful. My travel channel, another video. Thanks. I like this. I should probably do that. But either way, guys, thank you so much for joining me for this video. I found it quite interesting. I've never heard of this before neither, which is crazy because this sounds like a very important thing to know. And probably explains a lot of things. But I have never heard of this before. I wonder if you have. Let me know in the comments below. Once again, thank you for joining me. Please leave a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!